this first period of Ukrainian history, or era, or eras, and actually more precisely prehistory, lasted from about, as you can see on this chart, 1150 BC, or before the Common Era, and 850 AD. These 19 centuries of human development on Ukrainian territory, the general view here and the general understanding, this whole period witnessed a slow evolution from primitive-like agricultural and nomadic cultures and civilizations that were on this territory, a gradual move toward more advanced societies that attempted to create centrally organized state and socioeconomic structures. During these nearly 2 millennia, 2,000 years, Ukrainian territory was divided into two rather distinct spheres. Two spheres. The vast steppe, which comprises most of present-day southern Ukraine, and the coastal lowlands, and more particular, the coastal regions themselves, along the Black Sea and the northern shores of the Azov Sea. Within each of these two spheres, there were quite different socioeconomic and political structures. So difference on the one hand, but on the other hand, both were also closely linked in a kind of symbiotic relationship. There's a phrase which you can keep in your mind for this entire discussion, a symbiotic relationship based on a wide degree of economic interdependence. Economic interdependence. So here are these two regions. In the most general terms, the hinterland, north of the steppes, north of the coastal region. That hinterland was inhabited by sedentary agriculturalists who were ruled by differing nomadic military elites and tribes with them, most often having originated from the steppes of Central Asia. That second region, the Black Sea coast and Azov coast, was characterized by the establishment of Greek and later Roman Byzantine cities, city-states, that either functioned as independent entities, independent city-states, or at times joined together in a federation that had varying degrees of independence, or that were directly dependent on the Greek, Roman, or Byzantine homelands to the south. Put another way, during these nearly 2,000 years, the Black Sea cities and the hinterland of Ukraine were little more than appanages, add-ons, dependencies whose economic, social, and even cultural orientation was directed toward the classical civilizations of the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. So here we have in this entire period, looking south. This was the direction of civilization and the direction in which Ukrainian lands were closely tied. So let's look first at this steppe hinterland. Excuse me, sir. Can you do me a favor, please?
Yes.
Thank you. It is incredibly disturbing. With regard to this steppe hinterland, our initial information about these regions came from contemporary Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and Arabic writers who almost invariably painted negative descriptions of what they all considered fierce barbarians from the east, whose only purpose seemed directed at destroying the achievements of the civilized world as represented by ancient Greece and later the Roman and Byzantine empires. And it's in that sense that the few written sources that we do have suggest hardly more than an unending swarm of uncouth Asiatics with strange sounding names. And as you can see them on your list here, Cimmerians or Scythians or Sarmatians or Alans or Huns or Avars, Bulgars, Khazars. And these various peoples or tribes, we're going to see what that means in a second, progressively ruled the Black Sea hinterland before being driven out by the next nomadic invader. Now, it is true that archaeological evidence uncovered by discoveries, especially during the 20th century, has revealed that these nomadic peoples were neither as uncivilized nor bent exclusively on destruction as the ancient Greek and Roman Byzantine writers have made them out to be. In fact, the civilizations that these nomads from the east established were often more concerned with maintaining peace and stability that would enhance their own income from trade and commerce. Now, just a few more general caveats about this era. And these caveats we should also want to keep in mind. When referring to these various nomadic peoples and their invasions of the steppe region of Ukraine, modern observers, that is us, may get the impression, and I would say the misperception, that these fierce warriors coming from Central Asia were compact tribes representing one particular people. And also it might seem that these nomads entered territory north of the Black Sea that was uninhabited, and that they were the only ones there until pushed out by another nomadic people, which in turn took their place and began that demographic cycle all over again. Now, this scenario does not reflect reality. First of all, the Ukrainian steppe was never virgin, uninhabited land into which nomadic hordes arrived. Archaeological evidence has shown that the steppe, and for that matter all territories in present-day Ukraine, were inhabited throughout the Stone Age from its earliest Paleolithic era, going back to 200,000 years, to the most recent Neolithic stages, about 5,000 years. These newcomers from the east, and we need to remember again at least during the time frame under our consideration here, roughly again from 1150 BC to 850 AD. During that time, there were always fixed settlements on the territory of Ukraine, inhabited by people who derived their livelihood from agriculture, from the raising of livestock, and from trade. So much for virgin uninhabited land. The other misperception about this period concerns the nomadic invaders themselves. Despite the fact that classical authors, again from Greek, Roman, Byzantine worlds, gave names such as Cimmerians, Scythians, Sarmatians, and all of those that you see on your list here, none of those peoples named here, none was ever comprised of a culturally or ethno-linguistically unified people. Rather, they were variegated nomadic tribes who were sometimes united under the leadership of one tribe, and it was that one tribe that gave its name, or whose name was adopted by classical Greek or Roman authors who gave the name for the entire group. And aside from that, after arriving in Ukraine, these sedentary agricultural or pastoral settlers already living there were also subsumed under the name of the nomadic group, which actually just came to rule over them. But now they take on that name as well, or are given that name. It's in this more complex sense that we need to understand the names Scythians, Sarmatians, Khazars, etc. Okay, here's your list. Here's the chronological order, roughly. The first of these nomadic civilizations on Ukrainian territories, about which we have very limited information, what came to be known as the Cimmerians, as you can see on the first name on your chart. Hardly anything is known about them. There are a few archaeological remnants that are clearly dated from the period when they were on Ukrainian territory. The next group, however, we know something more about. Around the middle of the 8th century, that is around 750 BC, the Cimmerian era came to an end. Their leaders ostensibly fled westward across the Carpathian Mountains, which is a typical thing, by the way. This is where they go. When they're forced out, they flee west, they cross the Carpathians, and then they're somewhere in the heart of Europe. Why? Well, they were faced by a new invasion from the east, which are known as the Scythians. The Scythians. According to classical Greek authors, the Scythians were almost always characterized by their fierceness as warriors. But this one-sided image has been tempered by archaeological discoveries, which have unearthed numerous examples of finely wrought sculpture, ornamentation, jewelry. And I'm going to pass out this set of photographs. Take a set, you'll return them later. And you can see that beautiful gold wrought sculpture. This is a product of the Scythian period. Between 750 and 700 BC, at the very beginning, Scythians from the east moved westward toward what is modern-day Ukraine, and they settled for the most part at first in the Kuban region, which of course you now know from studying your maps, and that's that region just east of the Sea of Azov. Thank you. Also the Taman Peninsula, which is the eastern portion of the Crimea, and just on the other side of that infamous bridge that we see from time to time, waiting to be blown up today. That is that swirled. And so the Scythians concentrated there. They're on the steppe, but in particular in the peninsula of Crimea, where their civilization reached its peak between 350 and 250 BC, that is the end of this period. Now, classical sources tell us that Scythian society was composed of four groups. The royalty, the notables, agriculturalists, and plowmen. One might think that the agricultural and plowmen are more or less the same, but this is how the ancient Greeks described Scythian society. Now, as a society that was typical of the nomadic concept that I just spoke about, only the first two of these groups, that is the royalty and the notables, were comprised of Scythians themselves. This ruling elite of nomadic origin and lifestyle, they dominated the sedentary agriculturalists, living under their control, as well as they dominated the residents of cities, who, together with their rulers, were all known to the outside world as Scythians. Whether they worked the land, whether they lived in cities, whether they were nomads. Now, the mention of cities may seem confusing, because up to now we're discussing the steppe hinterland, focusing on nomads and the sedentary agriculturalists under their control living in the countryside. Well, in fact, it seems that the Scythian ruling elite, that is, this royalty and the nobles, virtually lived on horseback, roaming the steppes, hunting in search of food, or engaging in conflicts with neighboring tribes. And so at best, we might speak of mobile Scythian cities. That is, huge caravans of tribes, families, children. These caravans which moved from one place to another. But aside from these mobile cities, there were also a few, well, using the term cities, yes, more properly, concentrations of permanent settlers in one place and engaged in activity other than agriculture. So there were a few of these also to be found within this Scythian sphere. Now, these were so-called Oriental type cities. Well, what does that mean? They were fortified settlements owned by the Scythian royalty and nobles, and they were inhabited by remnants of those other peoples who had fled, in this case before them, the Cimmerians, and other tribes who paid tribute to the Scythian overlords. The most important and impressive of these cities during the last phase was Scythian cities in the heart of Crimea, and that is this black and white reconstruction of a place called Neapolis. Neapolis. It's actually quite near the modern-day city of Simferopol, which is more or less in the geographic center of the Crimean Peninsula. Okay, so we have a discussion of, for the moment, the Scythian context. We know a little bit now about the hinterland. And even some of these settlements, permanent settlements. But these Scythian settlements, quote-unquote cities, were no way as important as the Greek trading cities along the shores of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Not long after the Scythians were entering present-day Ukraine, as we saw in the middle of the 8th century, and they were coming from the east, colonists from the south, colonists fleeing civil strife in ancient Greece, of which was the common denominator of ancient Greek society, all these little city-states always fighting with each other, and so refugees or people fleeing, some went north, north of the Black Sea, especially from a town called Miletus. Now, Miletus, Greek settlement, is right down here on the eastern shores of the Black Sea in what is now present-day Western Anatolia or Turkey. And that's because ancient Greece included not only what we now know as modern-day Greece and Macedonia to the north, but also virtually all of the Western Anatolia, that is present-day Turkey. This was the Greek classical world. And so from this world, and in particular Miletus was one of the first places, arrived from the south settlements, Greeks. The result is that between the 7th and 5th centuries BC, several prosperous Greek cities came into being along the shores of the Black Sea, of the Straits of Kerch, and the Sea of Azov. So and almost always they were near the mouths of several of those rivers that you now know. So here we have a Greek town called Tiras, where the Dniester River flows into the Black Sea, Olbia, where the southern Bug flows into the Black Sea, Tanais, as we're going to see, near the Don River as it goes into the Sea of Azov, and as we're going to see a little bit later, Chersonesus Theodosius, and also Pontic-Aegean, which I'll mention on those straits of Kerch. Now, this ancient Greek homeland along both shores of the Aegean Sea, the western and the eastern, Greece and western Turkey today, that whole area was comprised of individual city-states, each of which very jealously guarded its independence, but nevertheless of political arguments, discussions, disagreements, wars, they were able to create a kind of unified civilization by the 5th century BC. A civilization whose achievements set the standard for culture in the civilized world in the West, known at the time, and also a culture and civilization that long outlasted the existence of the city-states themselves. We can just look around at buildings, many of which are based on classical Greek models. Now, like the ancient Greek homeland along the Aegean Sea, those colonies that I'm speaking about along the northern Black Sea coast also remained, at least initially, independent of each other, though dependent economically and politically with the city-state which founded them. And the two most important of them was that Miletus, which I just mentioned, and the other one was Megara, which is closer to modern-day Athens, that is on the western side of the Aegean. There were also periods when these Black Sea colonies not only were completely independent, but some even united into federations or proto-states. The most important of this federation principle came about in the year 480, when Greek cities near the Straits of Kerch began to unite under the leadership of a city-state colony called Pontic-Aegean, or Bosphor, or modern-day Kerch, on the western shores of the Straits of Kerch, that is the farthest eastern end of Crimea in present-day Ukraine. And under the leadership of Pontic-Aegean, they created what became known as the Bosporan Kingdom, because those Straits of Kerch were known as the Bosporan. They even had a dynamic king, a leader named Levkon, reigning in the end of the 4th century BC, who came to control all of Kerch and the Taman peninsulas and the whole eastern shore of the Sea of Azov up to a town called Tanais, where the Don River flows in. So this whole area becomes a federation known as the Bosporan Kingdom, which in many ways is the first state structure created in part on the territory of modern-day Ukraine. This Bosporan Kingdom flourished as a center of grain trade, fishing, winemaking, small-scale artisan craftsmanship, especially metalworking, until the second half of the 2nd century BC. It declined, but then in 63 BC, the Bosporan Kingdom came under, together with all the other states of Greece, it came under the control of the Roman Empire. But nonetheless, for most of this period between 700 BC and 250 BC, the Greek cities along the Black Sea littoral, also the southern Crimean Peninsula, and in this Bosporan Kingdom, all developed a kind of, to return, that symbiotic relationship with the hinterland, which was controlled at that time by the Scythians. And the Scythians by then had come to be based in that region between the lower Dnieper and Black Sea and in the southern portion of Crimea. And that is where that Scythian stronghold that you see here, Neapolis, came into being. Within this symbiotic relationship equation, the individual Greek cities, as well as those in that Bosporan Kingdom Federation, all acted as kind of trading and manufacturing emporiums between the Greek city-states on the one hand down to the south and the hinterland, the steppe hinterland to the north. And in between are these middle men, if you will. Controlling, most important, the trade. Trade in what? Well, food products in particular had come from the steppes of Ukraine. The Scythians extracted from the steppe populations under their control grain and fish, which they then traded in the Greek coastal cities, and together with cattle, hides, fur, wax, honey, and slaves, these products were then processed in the Black Sea coastal cities and then sent to the Greek city-states. So this is where the food for ancient Greece came. In turn, the Scythians bought from the Greeks textiles, wine, olive oil, artworks, other luxury items to satisfy their ever-increasing opulent tastes. And as a result of these economic interrelations, the Greeks brought to the world the first and still primary information about the Scythians. In fact, the famous Greek historian, considered the father of history, Herodotus, actually lived in one of these Greek city-states, Olbia, and it's there that he wrote his famous work in which he describes in some great detail the Scythians and their lifestyle. And his writings, combined with archaeological finds in burial mounds, which existed still up until the 20th century, until they were excavated. You can still see some of them. These are kind of like sloping hills, right? Underneath are buried the remnants of the Scythians. These burial mounds were known as kurhany in Ukrainian. Kurhany, kurgan. Right outside here, when you go toward the Robots Library, you get to the corner, and on the left-hand side, since Canadians and Ontarians like to decorate with natural growth, so you have this kind of wheat almost, right? And right behind it is a sloping hill, on top of which is a reindeer, because we're in Canada, or a pseudo-sculpture of a reindeer. But that's like a mini kurhan. So this is how you can remember, if you take your break while you're waiting on the corner, you can turn around and you can think you're somewhere on the steppes of Ukraine and standing on top of or alongside the remnants of Scythian civilization. So you'll never cross that street again without thinking of the Scythians. Now, despite the alleged barbaric lifestyle, which some scenes in Scythian art depict, such as that death struggle, as you can see, I think, here, on that illustration that I handed out. It still must be concluded that in an otherwise violent world, the Scythians brought an element of peace and stability to Ukrainian territories, which lasted for about half a millennia, for 500 years, and which has come to be known as the Pax Scythica. Pax, peace, order, the Scythian order. Around 250 BC, nomads related to the Scythians, as you can see on your chart, the Sarmatians, arrived also from the east, specifically from the Ural Mountains, and within a half a century, they drove the Scythians out of the steppe, and where the Scythians then took refuge in the Crimean Peninsula. Now, these Sarmatians, typical of the civilizations we have been discussing, typical in that they were not a homogeneous people, but rather consisted of several tribes, each of which led an independent existence. Now, among those Sarmatian tribes, those most directly associated with developments in Ukraine were as you can see underneath that, the Roxolani, the Alans, and the Antis. We're going to be hearing something about them, in particular the Antis, in our next lecture. As you can see from the dates, about 2 centuries from, I should say 4 centuries, from 250 BC to 250 AD, the relative stability under these Sarmatians and economic prosperity with the hinterland and on the Greek city-states was maintained for a good portion of that time. In a sense, the Sarmatian order. However, about 250 BC, or AD, I should say, this era of stability was replaced by an era of instability. And that not only affected the Sarmatian-controlled hinterland, also the Black Sea cities. Beginning in 63 BC, a little bit earlier, the Roman Empire succeeded in extending its sphere of influence over the independent Greek city-states that we've been speaking about, as well as over the Bosporan kingdom. Now, with the presence of Roman legions, this is the famous Roman Empire that controlled all of the northern and southern shores of the Mediterranean Sea and now farther east into the Aegean and Black Sea. Roman legions, governors in the region, they bring another era of peace and stability. And this new now Pax Romana, the Roman order, becomes characteristic of this part of Ukrainian lands. This Pax Romana mollified the friction between the Scythians and the Greeks in Crimea, and even the Sarmatian tribes in that hinterland became aware of the advantages to be accrued from some kind of cooperation with the Roman world. Now, within this context of the new stabilizing Roman presence, the Sarmatian Alans renewed the Scythian tradition of trade now with the Greco-Roman cities. In fact, we have the creation of a kind of Greco-Scythian Sarmatian hybrid civilization that evolved within the Bosporan kingdom. It was revived, this time under the protection of Rome. And the resultant trade and commerce between the steppe and the Mediterranean world brought new prosperity to the Bosporan kingdom, and that lasted through at least the first 2 centuries of the Common Era AD after Christ. Now we are on the 3rd century, the 200s in the Common Era AD. This 3rd century ushered in a new era of instability. Instability most especially in the steppe hinterland. And that was to last for almost half a millennia until the 7th century. During those 4 centuries plus, Ukrainian territory was subjected to the invasion of several new nomadic warrior tribes who were bent on plundering the classical world as represented now by the Black Sea and Bosporan coastal cities. And with few exceptions during this period, these tribes were not interested, as the Scythians and even the Sarmatians before them, not interested in settling down, not interested in exploiting by peaceful means the symbiotic economic relationship of the steppe, hinterland, and coastal cities, which almost became the norm. And so between about 250 and 650 AD, several of these nomads came and went across parts of Ukrainian territory. And there they are, Huns, Kutrigurs, Utigurs, Avars, Bulgars. And it was not until the arrival of that last group, the Khazars, that a new era of stability north of the Black Sea was finally restored. Era instability, long period, little bit of interesting tidbit here. This nearly 4 centuries or over 4 centuries of instability began, as you can see on the chart, not with the arrival of well, you wouldn't see this from the chart, but I'm now going to tell you. That first group did not consist of nomads from Central Asia, like virtually all of the others, but rather it began with the arrival in the early 3rd century of Germanic tribes from the north, known as Goths, as you can see on your chart. The Goths. They were actually originally from modern-day Sweden. They crossed the Baltic. They lived for a long period of time in what is modern-day Poland. And at some point in the middle of the 3rd century, circa 250 AD, they moved southward into Ukraine, where they broke up the dominance of the Sarmatians that had been there. One branch of these Goths, as you can see, not on your list, were called the Ostrogoths, which actually means the East Goths. The East Goths. They focused their control on the Crimean Peninsula and on the remnants of the Bosporan kingdom, which still had potential wealth that could be derived from the trade. Ostrogoth rule in Crimea reached its apogee during the late 4th century. There was a famous king, Ostrogothic king, Hermanadic, which is considered one of the first, quote-unquote, Germanic rulers in the world, of all places, in Crimea. And anxious to maintain good relations with the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire to the south, these Ostrogoths even accepted Christianity. We're going to see the role of that as we move on. They had their own bishop, their own church structure. They had a stronghold in a town called Doros in the western part of the Crimean Peninsula. And they came to be known in history as the Crimean Goths. So important was this in terms of the predecessors of the Germanic world, that during World War II, despite the height of the war, Hitler spent a large amount of money sending for archaeological expeditions to Crimea to find the remnants of Germanic civilization, and at the same time justify occupation of this Germanic land that was only for temporarily a couple millennia taken over by these dastardly Slavs that had to be eliminated and moved out, let alone the Crimean Tatars. So much for the use of history in modern day times. Now, while the Ukrainian steppe and the hinterland were experiencing frequent disruptions between the mid-3rd and mid-7th centuries, the coastal region along the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov was undergoing another revival. This time, the stabilizing factor was the Eastern Roman or the Byzantine Empire. The Eastern Roman or the Byzantine Empire, I'll elaborate a bit on that in the next couple lectures. We'll leave it there for the moment. That eastern part of the Roman Empire reached its greatest extent in the course of the 6th century, and that included Crimea. And all of those Black Sea coastal cities now received Byzantine garrisons. Their walls were fortified. And a town called Chersonesus, on the western shore of the Crimean Peninsula, near Sevastopol, modern-day Sevastopol, became the Byzantine cultural capital center of this Crimean world. In fact, your third or fourth black and white illustration shows what Chersonesus looked like. Some archaeological remnants and reconstructions. So it was truly an Eastern Roman world. Now, not long after the rise of this East Roman or Byzantine influence along the coast, which began in earnest during the late 6th century, a new group of nomads was to arrive, and not surprisingly, from where? Like all the others except the Goths, from the east. Their presence was to have a profound impact on developments north of the Black Sea. And who were they? A Turkic group of tribes known as the Khazars. Unlike most of their predecessors during those 3 preceding centuries of instability, the Khazars preferred diplomacy. Diplomacy, not war. And soon after their arrival along the Black Sea, that's the first thing they did. They signed a treaty with the East Roman or Byzantine Empire in 626. For their part, the East Romans or the Byzantines always worried about their eastern frontier. They're always in battle against the Persians on the eastern end of Anatolia. Also concerned about future potential invaders from the east who might threaten their Black Sea possessions. They welcomed the willingness of the Khazars to fit into their plans of the Byzantine diplomacy, to become part of what a later historian spoke about as we're going to see, the Byzantine Commonwealth. As I approach our conclusion, let me say this. The appearance of the Khazars in the 7th century is of great significance for developments in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe in general. Why? Well, in one sense, the Khazars continued or renewed the tradition established by the Scythians, then continued by the Sarmatians, whereby nomads from the east would gain control over the sedentary population of the steppe hinterland, keep in line recalcitrant nomadic tribes, protect trade routes, foster commercial contacts with the Greco-Roman Byzantine cities along the Black Sea coast. This age-old symbiotic relationship between the coast and steppe hinterland was about to be renewed now in the 7th century under the hegemony of whom? The Khazars. The resultant Khazar peace, and now we had Pax Scythica, Pax Romana, and now we have Pax Khazarica. The Khazar order was to last approximately from the mid-7th to the 9th centuries. And its presence, this Khazar order, did in fact cushion further nomadic invasions from the steppes of Central Asia, as well as from the Persians and Arabs from the south beyond the Caucasus Mountains. In that sense, the Khazars played a role which some writers have compared to Charles Martel and the Franks in Western Europe, protecting the rest of Europe along the Pyrenees mountains of northern Spain and France. This Pax Khazarica also provided at least 2 centuries of peace and stability in which sedentary peoples living within the Khazar sphere of influence were allowed to develop. And among those sedentary peoples, on the western edge of the Khazar world, were the Slavs. And it is to them that we will turn our attention when we return. Thanks.